Picture a species with no face, not because no one has drawn one, because no one can. There is no skull complete enough to work from, no skeleton, just enough bone to prove they existed, and not enough to show you what they looked like. In 2008, in a cave in Siberia, archaeologists found a fragment of bone, so small and so unremarkable that it was packed in a box and labeled, simply, modern human, a formality, nothing to look at twice. In a German lab, a couple of years later, that assumption fell apart. The genetic material extracted from that fragment did not match a modern human. It did not match a Neanderthal, either. It matched nothing on record. A third kind of human, never named, never even theorized. Every other extinct human species was found as a body first, identified second. This one was identified first. The body is still mostly missing. This is the species science discovered before it had a face to put on it. For most of the time since they disappeared, nobody knew there was anything left to find. You are one of the people who get to. To understand how strange this is, you need to understand how every other ancient human was found. Someone digs. They find a skull, a jaw, a handful of bones. They study the shape, and from that shape, they build a species. A name, a face, a place in the family tree. That is how Neanderthals were identified in 1856, decades before anyone could read a strand of DNA. Denisovans were found in reverse. The cave is called Denisova, in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, a cave system that different human groups used, on and off, for some 300,000 years. In 2010, the lab that opened that mislabeled box was Svante Pääbo's at the Max Planck Institute, the same lab, the same scientist, behind the Neanderthal genome work from this channel's first episode. Pääbo would go on to win the Nobel Prize in 2022, in part for the discovery this fragment kicked off. The genome that came back belonged to a lineage no one had ever identified, distinct enough, old enough to be its own branch of humanity. They named it after the only thing they had to go on, the cave, Denisovan. There is still no complete skull. What exists, in total, is almost absurdly small. A few teeth, a fragment of a finger, part of a jaw, found not in that cave at all, but high on the Tibetan plateau, in a cave called Baishia. A monk found it there in 1980, recognized it as something unusual, and handed it to a senior religious leader, who kept it as a sacred object for years before it ever reached a scientist. It was not identified as Denisovan until 2019, not from DNA, which had not survived, but from proteins still locked inside the bone. That jawbone alone is at least 160,000 years old, older than every other trace of this species combined. That is the entire physical record. You could fit what we have of them in a small box, which in a sense is exactly how this story started, and yet we know they were real. We know roughly where they ranged. We know they had children with two other kinds of human. We built a species from data before we built it from bone. Here is where it gets stranger. In some layers of Denisova cave, there are no bones at all, and researchers found Denisovan DNA there anyway, pulled straight out of the dirt. Sediment, not skeleton. The genetic residue of bodies that broke down so long ago that nothing solid remains except trace DNA bound to the cave floor itself. You can prove a population lived somewhere without a single bone to point to. We also know they were not simple. In a layer associated with Denisovan presence, archaeologists found a fragment of a bracelet, a polished dark green chlorite stone with a hole drilled clean through it, using techniques that look more at home in a much later period of human history. The nearest known source of that stone is roughly 200 kilometers from the cave. Somebody carried it that far, or traded for it, before they ever started carving. Then there is Deni. In 2012, excavators pulled a small bone fragment out of the same cave, one of more than 2,000 pieces too small or too worn to identify by eye. It sat in storage for years, until a 2016 protein screening flagged it as hominin. The DNA results, published in 2018, were stranger than anyone expected. Half her genome was Neanderthal, half was Denisovan. Her mother was Neanderthal, her father was Denisovan. She died at around 13 years old, roughly 90,000 years ago. The only first-generation hybrid of two extinct human species ever found. Not a population blending slowly over millennia. One specific meeting between two specific people that left a fragment of bone in a Siberian cave for us to find 90,000 years later. The evidence is so direct, Pääbo said when the results came back. We almost caught them in the act. We do not know anything else about her life. We know she existed, and we know exactly what she was made of. So where did they go? That question is harder to answer for Denisovans than for almost any other ancient human, because we do not fully know where they were to begin with. one cave in Siberia, one jawbone in Tibet, more than 3,000 meters up, dates to at least 160,000 years old. A handful of further traces, still debated, are in Laos and the islands of Southeast Asia. That is the entire physical footprint, sites separated by thousands of miles, across some of the most remote terrain on the planet. Neanderthals left a record, concentrated in one well-mapped region. Denisovans left what looks more like scattered postcards from a continent nobody has finished searching. But the DNA tells a bigger story than the bones do. People in Papua New Guinea, Aboriginal Australia, and the wider Near-Oceania region carry up to 5% Denisovan ancestry, among the highest archaic human inheritance found anywhere on Earth. To leave that much of a genetic mark that far from Siberia, Denisovans were not confined to one cave. They had to have ranged across an enormous stretch of Asia, for an enormous stretch of time, surviving everything from sub-zero mountain winters to tropical island environments most other ancient humans never touched. We are mapping the territory of a vanished people almost entirely from where their descendants live now, not from where we found their bones, from where we did not. Current estimates put their disappearance at somewhere around 30,000 years ago. But unlike Neanderthals, there is not a behavioral record substantial enough to argue over the causes. We do not know what their last generations looked like. We do not know if there was a final population, holding on somewhere in the mountains or the islands. We do not know if they were gradually absorbed, interbreeding generation after generation, until there was no meaningful line left between them and us, or if something faster ended them first. What we know is the outcome. The lineage stopped leaving fossils, and in the silence between the last trace of their DNA and the present day, an entire kind of human ran out so quietly that we still do not know exactly when or how. Here is what we do know for certain. Some of it is specific enough to trace to a single mountain range. Take altitude. People native to the Tibetan Plateau carry a Denisovan version of a gene called EPAS1. It changes how the body responds to thin air, instead of thickening the blood the way most human bodies do at altitude, which raises the risk of clots and strokes. The Tibetan version keeps it thin. It lets people live and work above 3,500 meters, where most bodies start to struggle, without that cost. It was solved by Denisovans, in exactly that kind of cold, thin-aired extreme, hundreds of thousands of years before anyone needed the solution again. Here is the strange part. Melanesian populations carry some of the highest overall Denisovan ancestry on Earth, and most of them do not have this particular gene at all. It never made it into their line, or it did, and was not useful enough in a tropical climate to stick around. The immune system tells a similar story. In 2019, researchers at the Garvan Institute identified a Denisovan gene variant that sharpens immune and inflammatory responses in some people of Papua New Guinean descent. The first time a single inherited variant from an extinct human species had been shown to directly change how a living person's immune system behaves. And earlier this year, Yale geneticists Patrick Riley and Serena Tucci published the largest map of Denisovan DNA ever assembled. They found more than 3,000 separate genetic variants, inherited from Denisovans, still actively switching immune system genes on and off in people across Near-Oceania today. Most of those variants had never been catalogued before this study. Some of what Denisovans gave to the people descended from them, we are only finding out about right now. Picture a Neanderthal. Scientists have given you that face, reconstructed from real skulls, real measurements, the heavy brow and the broad nose. You could stand close to it. You will never do that with a Denisovan. There is no skull complete enough to build one from. No face anyone can hand you. Just a finger bone, a jaw that sat with a monk for 40 years, a scatter of teeth, and dirt that remembers them after their bones did not. They are the most real maybe in human history, undeniably there, and almost completely invisible. There is a version of this episode that would have ended differently. It would have told you that some piece of this is in you too, a private feeling, reframed as ancestral evidence and all, the kind of close that makes a clean exit. That is the tidy version. It is also not quite honest. If your ancestors trace to the Tibetan Plateau, or to Papua New Guinea, Aboriginal Australia, the Bismarck Archipelago, the Solomon Islands, then yes, some of what you just heard may genuinely be running in your body right now, doing a job it has been doing for tens of thousands of years. For most people watching this, that is not true. You could have your whole genome sequenced tomorrow and find nothing. No percentage, no gene, nothing in you that ever touched a Denisovan. Inheritance was never a blanket. It was always going to be a handful of specific threads, in specific people, surviving for specific reasons. That is not a hole in this story. That is the story. Because the most important thing about this species was never how much of them ended up in your blood. It is how close they came to leaving no trace anyone would ever find, in anyone. One bone, packed in a box with the wrong species written on the side. One jaw, carried by a monk who could have let it be ground down for medicine. The way bones like it had been before. A people who left almost nothing behind, and nearly left nothing behind that we would ever recognize as theirs. They did not get absorbed the way the last ones did. They got rediscovered. Late, barely, and not finished. Part of what you just heard is only months old. Somewhere, a researcher is looking at sediment from that cave right now, finding sequences nobody has read yet. So if you do not carry them in your blood, here is what you do carry. You are alive at the exact moment in human history when it became possible to know they existed at all. For most of the time since they disappeared, nobody did. Not one person. Not for 30,000 years. You are not their inheritance. You are their witness. Right when it was almost too late for there to be one. There's a line this channel keeps coming back to. They didn't disappear. You absorbed them. For the Neanderthals, that's true in your blood. For the Denisovans, it might only be true in this, that you know their name now. That, for the first time since they vanished, someone finally does.